Okay, so this video is intended to take you through the feedback from a language change essay. The question was, evaluate the idea that new lexical items enrich and develop the language. This is a English Language Paper 2, Section A style essay on diversity and change. So a reminder of the top band for AO1, remember AO1 is about methods of analysis, terminology and good academic written expression. So we need to apply linguistic methods, terminology and identify patterns and complexities. So I need to be able to give different examples, I need to be able to use complex terminology, and that terminology needs to be peppered all the way through in a really convincing way. And then I also need to guide the reader with an academic writing style. And so we're going to use some of those conceptualizing and evaluation stems and some of those academic introduction techniques to make sure that I'm guiding the reader through my arguments. When we do this, we're going to talk in a little bit when we think about AO2 and how well we evaluate. We're going to use the metaphor of a tennis game. So when we're evaluating an idea, we want to be considering both viewpoints. So using academic connectives, academic linking phrases can really help that. And so guiding the reader through your arguments and then summarising them at the end is going to help you get in that top band for AO1. AO2 is about critical understanding of concepts and issues related to language. So they can be theory or they might be generalised concepts associated with language. So for instance, something like standardisation, that's a language concept. Or something like prescriptivism, that's a language concept. Or functional theory, that's a language concept. But if I'm talking about Chen's S-curve model, that's a particular theory associated with a particular theorist. So if I'm using any of those, then I'll be getting marks for AO2. But AO2 is for demonstrating a synthesized, conceptualized and individualized overview of the issues. So thinking about what the big issues are that affect that question, that idea I've been given, what are those big ideas, and conceptualizing them into almost little clusters of argument throughout your essay. But I also get the maximum marks for AO2 for evaluating and challenging the views. Is there another theory that counters that? Is there a limited validity in that argument? Is there another way we could approach and interpret the linguistic idea, which in this case is about new lexis? So that's what we need to keep doing consistently. So let's look first of all about what makes a brilliant introduction. So a brilliant introduction will start with a definition of the keywords or some contextualizing of those keywords. So you might start with an explicit definition. You might say, to say that something is enriching means that it develops something positively, that it adds value to something. And to say that something is developed means that it improves, it moves forwards, it is made better in some way. Now, I would start with a keyword definition such as that, or I would make sure that I absolutely use those keywords in my opening sentence. So I might say something like, there are numerous arguments about lexis and whether it is enriching and developing to our language, or whether viewpoints about the danger of new words and the reticence around new slang are valid. So I just need to make sure that I use the keywords to make sure that the examiner knows that I'm focused on those. But by doing a definition, it really signifies to the examiner that you know what those keywords mean and what you're really being asked about. Then you're going to contextualize language change. There are certain ideas I would always talk about at the start of a language change essay. So I might always talk about the perpetual flux of language, the fact that language is always changing, the fact that it can't generally be halted, the fact that this is something that has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I might open with something like, the English language has been in perpetual flux since its Anglo-Saxon origins to the present day. In fact, that rate of change has increased exponentially as the years have gone on, owing largely to developments in technology and communication. So just show that you understand that language change is a big issue. It's something that continues. And the idea that language isn't static is a big AO2 synoptic idea that you need to really communicate clearly, I think, with the language change essay. Then I would outline the differing arguments and why this is a valid discussion point. So with a language change essay, it makes sense really to contextualise the general attitudes towards language change and to talk very briefly about what prescriptivism and descriptivism are. And this for me always comes quite early in a language change essay because it's probably the biggest concept in language change. But you might talk about why lexis is contentious, for instance, why some people kind of demonize new slang and are almost afraid of it. Some of you made brilliant points about the idea that it was isolating and that potentially it's not accessible to all areas of the community, which was good. So here's an example introduction. Now KEIRA takes an explanation of what language change is. The things that I've highlighted here are in pink. So I've highlighted those because they're AO1. They're things that she would get AO1 terminology marks for. So language change is a phenomenon by which permanent alterations are made in the features and the use of language over time, which leads to phonological changes, lexical changes, semantic changes, and syntactic changes. Now those are actually the words that I used in one of the slides for one of the lessons, but there's nothing wrong with you learning particular phrases like that if it makes you feel confident, and using that at the beginning shows a real understanding of some of the terminology as well, those different frameworks. She then goes on to say every year 1,000 new words are added to the Oxford English Dictionary, enriching and developing our language. Now she's connected the idea of lexis to the keywords for the question, and that's good. Okay, what she hasn't done though is contextualised the kind of arguments, but she has done in quite a concise way a focus on those keywords and a bit of an introduction there. Barley's goes directly into the part that's almost missing from KEIRA's. So Barley does talk about the descriptive view and the prescriptivist view and contextualises those at the beginning. So she says the typical descriptivist view of language is that it's constantly changing and evolving and that it follows a natural course of new words being coined and old words dropping out of use and becoming archaisms. Contrary to this, prescriptivists believe that the English language needs to be preserved and that the addition of new words is toxifying to the historic language. Now that bit's great. She then tacks on the end a neologism refers to a new lexical term being added to the language. I don't think that really adds anything at that stage. It's not really helping us to evaluate the issue. It's kind of just a random piece of terminology defined. So I would take that part off, but this part on Barley's would have really nuanced and improved KEIRA's, because she talks about prescriptivists and descriptivists. However, Barley does go straight into this, which seems a bit strange. She's not used the keywords, and she's not contextualised the argument about those keywords and why it's important for language change. So it's almost not an introduction here. It's as though it's zoomed straight into some of the arguments, but still it's a good discussion of that kind of overall overarching two attitudes to arguments for language. This is Ruby's example. And what I like about Ruby's is that she starts with the words, it could be argued that. Now, if you're evaluating, that is an evaluating stem. That shows that she's being tentative right from the beginning, and I like that. So she says it could be argued that neologisms and new lexical items enrich and develop our language and are necessary to keep up with the constant societal changes and progressions. As the world develops, so does the language to accommodate new ideas, political correctness, technological changes, and many more factors which all enrich the language. However, a prescriptivist may argue that changes to the language are negative and that standard English is the only correct language and should stay the same. Now, I like this one. What this one does, it doesn't define the keywords. It does outline some of the main arguments by mentioning prescriptivists. It kind of mentions descriptivists in a kind of implied fashion, but what I like about this is it really contextualises the continuously changing nature of lexis and why that could be contentious for some people. Emma's here is much longer. Now Emma's does all of those three things added together, but it is quite long, but you can see that she actually uses the prescriptivism and descriptivist thing to start introducing her arguments. She uses that there are arguments to suggest, alternatively, they would argue. So she's almost now getting into the evaluation. But what she does here is she starts with the definition, and she starts with the contextualising of why lexis changes. So lexical items are forever entering our language due to its ever-changing and transient nature. That's a nice introduction to that idea of flux, perpetual change. The verb to enrich means to enhance the quality or value of something, and to develop means to grow, advance or elaborate. Lexical items such as new coinages or neologisms are very common within our language, which is why the Oxford English Dictionary adds or removes new words every 3 months, some of which may have grown rapidly in popularity due to exploration, a world crisis or technological advancements, while others may now be classed as archaisms and be seen as antiquated, and some now completely obsolete. Therefore, because our language is in perpetual flux and isn't static, There are arguments to suggest that the constant flow of new lexical items can enrich and develop our language. Yet alternatively, some prescriptivist views consist of ideas that new lexical formations are damaging and take away some notorious and prestigious elements of language, as they would argue we are unable to code switch, and therefore some precious characteristics of standard English can get lost and replaced by TeamSpeak and the incomprehensible slang that arises in some of these new lexical items, perhaps. Now, what I like about this is the fact that there's lots of tentativeness. There are arguments, they would argue, alternatively, perhaps. But what Emma's done here is she's almost started to go then into her analysis. If we were to stop at now completely obsolete, that would be almost the end of Emma's introduction there. And then actually her first point on prescriptivism and descriptivism, because it's so well evidenced, becomes almost part of the main body of her essay. But this is really good. I really particularly like the introductions to the keywords, the contextualizing of why lexis is important within that argument about language change, and some of the main arguments and attitudes towards language change. So those are just some examples of some introductions. What makes a brilliant main body of your essay? Well, relevant big ideas, those areas that relate to the question. So in this case, that might be working through the different areas that contribute new lexis and the validity of these as enriching to English. And people who did this really well did this by kind of considering different types of lexis, like borrowings, like neologisms, things like semantic changes or political correctness, and use those different types of new lexis to evaluate their validity, and possibly suggested that, for instance, political correctness is technically use of new lexis, but it's important for equality. People who recognised that were writing really well. Equally, if we talked about, maybe the argument being that the view is that slang is maybe less valid. However, there are many researchers like Partridge and like Crystal who suggest that slang is actually really integral and important, and every generation has it. So relevant big ideas worked through is what we need here, and spending a bit of time doing a really good plan makes all of the difference. We then introduce using a conceptualizing stem. We've talked about these before, but I'll show you some examples in a moment, how we introduce the different arguments. At every stage I need examples, and at every stage I need to relate to some relevant theory to evaluate that. And I also want to use an evaluation of the statement. So this was about whether it was enriching and whether it developed the language. You need to decide to what extent you can agree with that idea based on the examples and the theory that you have presented. Do you agree to a large extent, to a certain extent? Do you feel that the kind of both sides of the argument are valid? Is it different depending on which kinds of new lexis you're thinking about? Is political correctness, for instance, more valid than, say, technological acronyms, or are they both equally necessary in society? Those kind of arguments are the evaluation. But then challenge. Does the research counter this? And I would advise you to use a tennis metaphor, that idea of kind of batting it back from both sides before you make an informed decision. But equally, you can be tentative. You don't have to say, yes, it absolutely is true, and you do agree, or no, you absolutely don't. You can sit a little bit on the fence, but remember, sitting on the fence, you need to take the stance of a descriptivist. That's really important. As a linguist, we're always descriptivists. We can't be saying in our essays that we're submitting for our A-level, therefore I think slang is awful and it's an aberration and it's damaging to the language, because as linguists we are informed on the topic and we know that's not the case. So here's some really good effective conceptualizing. So this is what I mean by talking through the big ideas. So if you look in the bold part, language economy, lexical gaps, international language, the language of the internet. These are big concepts that we're talking about, and they're areas in the essay. But the way we introduce them clearly signifies that conceptualizing. So another way in which lexical items are enriching, another factor which contributes, another reason why neologisms are added to the English language. These are all really good conceptualizing stems from Annabel and Lily. And if you look at the bottom there, I've just taken some of the examples that were from your conceptualizing stems examples, and they were things like a further aspect which must be considered is. Further weight for this argument can be provided by. In addition, X provides compelling evidence for the argument that. So it just allows you to move on and show that you really are carefully considering the evidence that you're presenting. Good use of examples here. We can see in Josh's examples, we've got zeitgeist, the spirit or mood of a time in history, glockenspiel, a percussion instrument with fine-tuned keys in a similar style to the piano, yet with a small wooden drumstick type stick. Now, my only worry about that for this one, Josh, is I'm concerned about whether you'd remember that definition. But don't worry, you could just put zeitgeist, the spirit or mood of a time in history, and glockenspiel. People know what a glockenspiel is. That's absolutely fine. You don't necessarily need to define them all with a big long definition. Josh has also included neologisms, infodemic, discotheque, the borrowing, political correctness, LGBT, MUX, initialism, BCV, before coronavirus, the clipping of Sani for hand sanitizer. These are really great examples. My only health warning here would be make sure that they are worked into the prose as you're writing. Beware overuse of brackets because it can make it really, really difficult to read. And if your argument is really hard to follow because it's just full of brackets rather than clear academic prose, you're unlikely to get into the top 2 bands in terms of AO1, even if you know your stuff. So just bear that in mind. Try and keep it simple, clear sentences rather than really long extended questions with loads and loads and loads, sorry, sentences with loads and loads and loads of different examples in. Okay, now this is a long one, but I think this is a good one for us to have a look at. So I talked about the tennis metaphor, and this is Olivia doing the evaluate and challenge things. Let's just have a look at the things I've highlighted. So many prescriptivists could view this phenomenon and development of language as a threat, as they focus on correctness along with emphasising the rules and guidelines of language and grammar. Furthermore, they may feel linguistic innovations are overpowering our language, flooding it with unnecessary terms that are possibly confusing and excluding those that don't use neologisms, especially slang. So in the red, you can see there, she's presenting the argument of the prescriptivist. Then in the green, we can see that she is almost challenging that and batting it away, like returning a serve with another argument. So while this may be a valid argument to a certain extent, functional theory can be used to counter such criticism, as this theory suggests that language always changes and adapts to the needs of its users, along with the changes in industry and technology fueling the demand for neologisms. They would furthermore argue that this method enables new inventions to gain their title so we can talk about them easily, whilst also dropping certain words from our language such as vinyl and cassette, as they are no longer required. The use of initialisms, including USB and PC, could be viewed as conforming to this theory, as they are terms more commonly used in society for a faster and more efficient pace of communication. Moreover, the demand to increase the use of information passed through communication has led to a large amount of shortened lexis, called clippings, in modern language and specifically technological language, which could prove the significance of the functional theory in relation to language change. Furthermore, so she then supports that again and says, here's another reason why I think that's probably not valid. I've talked about functional theory and why language change is important, particularly in words. And now I'm going to give you another argument. Furthermore, to a greater extent, Chen's S-curve model that focuses on the progression of language change could oppose the view of a prescriptivist. His model describes the life cycle of slang and suggests that neologisms begin at a slow pace in terms of their use before a period of rapid increase, where their use spreads widely and becomes more common and accepted, before finally tailing off and only being used by a select group. And the only part I would change here, because I love the way that this is batting back the 2 arguments, Olivia then says, therefore, this model highlights the brevity and importance of development in language change through the use of new lexical items, particularly slang. Now that is a little bit vague. I think the therefore could be better handled in terms of actually talking about Chen's S-curve model. Chen's S-curve model is about the short life cycle of slang. So actually, a prescriptivist need not be concerned. It just changes all the time. It's like a continuous treadmill of new terminology that's coming in and out of fashion. So that really is the point that we want to make here about why Chen's S-curve model opposes the view of a prescriptivist. So I've just added this instead. Therefore, while a prescriptivist may have some concern about the use of new lexis, Chen's model suggests that the life cycle of slang terms is limited, and therefore we should not be concerned about the frequency with which new words enter the language, as they are also lost at a similar rate. Lexis reflects trends much as fashion does, as each generation develops their own language to reflect the world in which they live. Okay, so that's that kind of tennis metaphor. Now when I'm finished on this section, I need to remember to use those words, enriches, development, and I need to make sure that I'm going back to that. And I'm particularly going to do that in my conclusion, getting very muddled today, in my conclusion. So a good metaphor for that effective evaluation, we're saying all the time, well, to some extent, argument A, argument B suggests this, therefore it seems fair to assume that overall, here's what I think about the statement. So that's what you're going to try and do as much as possible. Now, sometimes there's a more persuasive argument on one side. That's fine, but if you can bat it both ways, that works really, really well. And if you're only strengthening an argument on one side, that's absolutely fine, but make sure that at some point throughout your essay, you have challenged the ideas with ideas on the other side of the argument. And finally, what makes a brilliant conclusion? Draw a final conclusion, but be tentative and measure up all the evidence you have presented. To a large extent, it seems clear that. To a certain extent, it seems clear that. To some extent, it seems clear that. Use those evaluation stems that you got so used to using at GCSE. Despite the arguments about ideas such as, talk about the things that are on the side that you don't agree with. However, explain what you can conclude. And always link back to your keywords. So here's a model conclusion from Emma. To summarise, there are many arguments to suggest that lexical items enrich and develop the language as they allow for new developments and understanding and enhance our ability to explore language and define particular eras in history through lexis. That said, the alternative argument is that lexical items may be damaging for the language, as the more our language changes, the more it may deviate from the standard English that many prescriptivists feel an avid need for. I personally believe that. Now, the only thing I would change slightly is just beware of over-personalising your essay. So instead, I would say something like, overall, however, we can conclude that, or it can be concluded that, just to avoid any I believe, I thinks in your essay. But here, Emma has summarised the arguments on one side, the arguments on the other side. However, overall, this is what I can conclude. And so you're drawing together all those different tennis ideas that you've batted backwards and forwards in one final short paragraph at the end. Now, obviously, if you don't get time to do this in the exam because you're rushing, an examiner is more interested in the arguments that you presented in your earlier paragraphs. But this will really help to conceptualise what is your overall argument and equally what is the overall evaluation that you can make of the statement. And so it is really powerful for that and making sure that that is done well. Okay, right, so what we need you to do now is go back to your own essay to review against those different checklists, please. So against the things that an introduction needs, the things that the main body needs, and the things that the conclusion needs. And using your red pen or a red font, obviously if you've typed, now is the time for you to go back and make those improvements at each section. Okay, step by step. But well done. The quality overall was really, really good. I'm really impressed for your first language change essay.